Vienna, 1873. Franz von Lenbach's studio exudes the dense aroma of oil paints and varnish, while winter light filters into the burgundy velvet curtains, creating golden shadows that dance on unfinished canvas. There, sitting in a peg, blue stuff armchair, a young woman of 25 years remains property for hours, her ivory silk dress contrasting with the melancholy emanating from her dark eyes. Maria Beccadelli di Bologna, then Countess Dönhoff, notes the painter to work with the same silent intensity with which he watches her. There is something ghostly at that moment, the way it holds a small Japanese silk range between the fingers, not to shake itself, but as those holding an amulet against the void. Von Lenbach, known for capturing the soul of his models, seems to have found something disturbing on her face, a beauty that carries the weight of unfulfilled expectations, an elegance that hides still open wounds. The silence is broken only by the distant noise of carriages on Vienna's stoned streets, but inside the studio, time seems suspended. She does not yet know that this portrait will be one of the few things that will remain her in collective memory, a frozen image in paint and melancholy, witness to a life that will oscillate between absolute power and total erasure. The fan in his hands, delicate as his ambitions, resistant as his pride, prefer an entire existence dedicated to beautiful and fragile objects, symbols of a luxury that will never be able to fill the void left by denied affections and imposed choices. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is the perfect time. Today we will dive into the story of a woman who lived between 2 centuries, 2 identities and 2 empires, leaving behind only scandal whispers and the fantasy fragrance of imported silk. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to lose any of the stories we explore here, narratives of lives that mirror the deepest contradictions of your day. This is the story of Maria Anna Zoe Rosalia Beccadelli di Bologna, born on February 6, 1848, in the golden halls of a Neapolitan palace, when Europe still believed that aristocracy was eternal and that luxury was a universal language of power. Daughter of Domenico Beccadelli di Bologna, Prince di Camporeale, and Laura Acton, Mary came into the world at a time when Italy was just a fragmented dream in ducados and kingdoms, and when she was an aristocrat meant to exist in a perpetual theater of appearances. The context that shaped his childhood was that of the Neapolitan aristocracy of the 19th century, a social class that lived from memories of greatness as he observed restlessly the transformations that would sweep Europe in the following decades. Naples, with his palaces in peach reflecting in the Mediterranean Sea, his salons where French was spoken before the Italian, his generation-lasted etiquette rituals, was the last bastion of an ancient world and the first laboratory of a new world. The Beccadelli di Bologna family represented this duality, old enough to claim prestige, but modern enough to understand that prestige alone does not guarantee survival. Maria's childhood was marked by the presence of objects, samples of madrepella from China, gold, framed Venetian mirrors, Persian rugs that told stories in their intricate patterns. These objects were not mere decoration. It was language through which its social class communicated values, ambitions, memories. Each piece was chosen not only for its beauty, but for its ability to tell a story about who had it, where it came from, which it represented in the complex status game that defined the aristocratic life. But what no one could anticipate was like this education through objects molding Maria so deeply. She learned from an early age that beauty was power, but also that power was ephemeral. He watched how his mother, Laura, organized family halls, supervising every detail, from the disposition of the flowers to the selection of the guests, as a conductor orchestrating a silent symphony. It was a real power, but exercised in the shadows, through subtle gestures, calculated glances, conversations that looked casual but were deeply strategic. When Domenico died in 1863, Mary was only 15 years old, but had already understood that the life of an aristocratic woman was a succession of losses disguised as gains. The death of the father not only represented mourning, it was the first real blow to the structure that sustained its existence. Laura, now a widow, quickly married Marco Minghetti, who would become a prime minister of the newly united Italy. It was a brilliant, strategic, necessary, and deeply revealing move on the precarious nature of female security, even among the aristocracy. For M. Aria, observing the mother's reinvention was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. Laura Acton became Laura Minghetti with the same elegance with which she changed her dress, but Maria perceived the emotional cost of this metamorphosis. The mother had learned to adapt, to reinvent herself, to find new sources of protection and influence. It was a lesson that Mary would absorb deeply. Women in her class did not have the luxury of stability. They had only the luxury of the appearance of stability. In this context, objects have acquired an even deeper meaning. They represented continuity in a world of constant change. As people died, empires fell, borders redesigned, a range of silk remained beautiful. A Venetian mirror continued to reflect the light in the same way. Maria developed an almost mystical relationship with these possessions, as if they were anchors in an ocean of uncertainty. Maria's formal education followed the standards of her class: French, piano, watercolor painting, classical literature, art history. But his real education was in the halls, observing how the women of his family sailed the social and political complexities of their time. She learned that aristocratic female power was always indirect, always mediated, always dependent on the ability to influence men who, in turn, influenced the world. Von Lenbach's portrait, painted when she was 25, captures just this moment of transition. Among the young woman who had been educated to a world of aristocratic certainties, and the woman who was beginning to understand that this world was disappearing. The range in your hands is no longer just an accessory. It is a symbol of fragility disguised as elegance, power that exists only while recognized by others. There was a peculiar melancholy in the way Maria was related to luxury. Unlike other women of their generation who saw beautiful objects as status symbols, it seemed intuitively understanding that they were symbols of impermanence. Each range acquired every inherited jewelry. Each dressed dress was simultaneous trophy and lament, celebration of a golden gift and recognition of its transitory nature. When von Lenbach fell in love with her during the portrait sessions, Mary first experienced the power of her own image. The painter, known for his professional coldness, became obsessive, visiting Vienna repeatedly just to see her, painting her memory when she was not present. But Maria, already versed in the emotional economy of her class, understood that that passion was addressed not to the real woman, but to the image she projected, a mixture of accessibility and mystery, vulnerability and haughty. The rejection she offered von Lenbach was not cruel, it was educational. She allowed him to understand, through the very experience of refusal, which meant something beautiful and unreachable. It was a lesson about the nature of luxury, its ability to awaken desires that, by definition, cannot be completely satisfied. Mary was turning into a living art object, something that could be admired, desired, even temporarily, but never truly understood or controlled. Mary's first marriage in 1867, at the age of 19, represented everything she had calculated and romanticized in the 19th century aristocratic marriage system. Karl August, Conde von Donhoff, was the kind of suitor his family considered ideal. Prussian diplomat, ancient family, complementary fortunes, useful political connections. The marriage was celebrated in Lugano, a geographical choice that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of aristocratic alliances, neither completely Italian nor completely German, but Europe in a way that transcended national borders. Ceremony was a silk and protocol show. Maria wore a dress that had taken months to make, with yields of Brussels and pearls that belonged to the family for generations. But even while pronouncing the votes, there was something theatrical in the ceremony, as if all present were aware that they participated in a ritual whose meaning was transforming rapidly. The 19th century aristocratic marriage was becoming anachronistic, even while being celebrated. Maria turned into Marie, a metamorphosis that went beyond the simple francization of the name. It was a complete reinvention, designed to facilitate its integration into Prussian diplomatic circles. Marie von Donhoff moved through the Berlin halls with the studied elegance of someone who had learned to be multiple, to adapt to contexts without ever losing their Italian essence completely. The early years of marriage took place in a succession of diplomatic residences, each decorated according to the taste of the time, each demanding a version, the slightly different from Marie. In Berlin, she was the diplomat's wife, discreet but informed. In Paris, it became the exotic Italian, capable of offering unique perspectives on continental policy. In London, he assumed the role of the continental European, sophisticated enough to sail the complexities of Victorian society. But it was in the privacy of his rooms that Marie revealed her true nature. Its rooms became personal museums, full of objects that carried from one residence to another. They were not just possessions, they were identity anchors. Each range, each mirror, every small porcelain sculpture represented a facet of her personality that she could not express publicly. In public life, it was forced to be malleable, adaptable. In private life, these objects allowed him to maintain some internal consistency. Marriage, however, began to reveal its cracks in the 1870s. Karl, as many men in his class and time, considered marriage another administrative rather than emotional issue. He had his diplomatic responsibilities, his intellectual interests, his social expectations. Marie was part of this structure, important but not central. She, in turn, began to understand that she had exchanged the uncertainty of being a young widow for the certainty of being a neglected wife. The situation became more complex when the children were born. Eugenie in 1868 and Siegfried in 1871. Maternity offered Marie a new source of identity, but also new limitations. As an aristocratic mother, she was expected to be affectionate, but not overly involved, present, but not dominant. Children were raised by housekeepers and educators, while Marie supervised at a distance, ensuring that they received the appropriate education for their class. But it was in the relationship with the objects that surrounded his children that Marie found an indirect way of expressing the affection that social protocols limited. She personally selected each toy, every book, every piece of clothing. transforming the act of giving gifts to a language of love that could not be expressed directly. Children's rooms became extensions of their own aesthetic sensitivity spaces, where beauty and affection merged so that it was impossible in the family's public spaces. The decade of 1870 brought changes that made the maintenance of marriage appearances unsustainable. Karl became increasingly absorbed in his diplomatic activities, treating Marie more as a social employee than as a companion. She, in turn, began to develop a rich and complex inner life that found little correspondence in the life she officially led. It was during this time that Marie began collecting fans, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They were not just accessories. They were objects that condensed their philosophy of life. A range was simultaneously useful and decorative, practical and symbolic. Open revealed its internal complexities. Closed kept its secrets. It could be used to communicate through subtle codes understood by other women, or to create distance, establishing an elegant barrier between the bearer and the outside world. The collection grew until it included pieces from all over Europe and Asia. Japanese fans with flower cherry paintings, French fans with carved ivory rods, Spaniards with lace that looked like golden cobwebs. Each piece told a story, not just about its origin, but about the moment Marie had acquired her, the emotional state in which she was, the aspirations she nourished. The most significant thing was that Marie not only collecting fans, she studied them. He had learned about manufacturing techniques, about the cultural meanings of different styles, about the social history of these objects. It was as if, through this erudition, it was building an intellectual identity that would transcend the limitations of its social role. She became an expert in something no one expected her to master, creating a space of competence exclusively her. When von Lenbach painted his portrait in 1873, Marie held one of her favorite fans, a Japanese hand-painted silk piece with images of butterflies that seemed about to fly out of the surface. The choice was not casual. At that moment, she had already understood that her life would be a succession of metamorphoses. The fan represented both the need for these transformations and the hope that, in the end, some beauty would remain. The 1870s also marked the beginning of the tensions that would lead to the end of the marriage. Karl began to show impatience with Marie's interests, considering her passion for decorative objects, such as aristocratic frivolity. He did not understand that, for her, these objects represented much more than decoration. They were forms of man have connection with aspects of your personality that the marriage life suppressed. Marie, in turn, began to realize that marriage was turning her into an impoverished version of herself. The woman who had been educated to appreciate beauty, culture, intellectual complexity was being reduced to the role of efficient diplomatic hostess. It was a reduction that she resisted in increasingly elaborate ways, creating private beauty and meaning rituals that compensated for the aridity of her public life. The year 1882 marked the official end of a union that had been slowly disintegrating for almost a decade. Marie von Dönhoff's divorce was not just the end of a marriage. It was a scandal that reverberated through the aristocratic circles of 3 countries and exposed the fundamental contradictions that defined the lives of elite women in the late 19th century. The legal process was conducted with the discretion required by the social class of those involved, but this did not prevent rumors from spreading through the halls of Berlin, Vienna, and Paris. Some versions suggested incompatibility of temperaments. Others implied financial issues. The most malicious spoke of infidelities on both sides. Truth, as often happens in aristocratic scandals, was simultaneously simpler and more complex than any rumor. Marie had come to the conclusion that she could not continue to live a life that reduced her to a decorative function. Karl, in turn, seemed genuinely puzzled by his wife's objections, considering that she had everything a woman of her position should wish: status, security, children, a respectable position in society. The mutual inability to understand the needs of the other transformed what could have been a friendly separation into a long and painful process. But the true scandal was not divorce itself. It was Marie's decision to seek a papal annulment. At a time when the Catholic Church rarely granted cancellations, especially for marriages that had produced children, Marie's initiative was seen as extraordinarily bold. She argued that marriage had been contracted under family pressures that compromised her freedom of choice, an allegation that was technically valid but socially explosive. The canonical process extended for 2 years, during which Marie had to be witnessed repeatedly about the most intimate aspects of her marriage life. It was a calculated humiliation, designed to discourage other women to follow their example. But Marie persevered, hiring specialized canons, gathering testimonies, building a case that was legally solid, even being socially subversive. In 1884, when the Pope finally granted the annulment, the established precedent was significant. The papal decision implicitly recognized that even aristocratic women were entitled to free consent in their marriage choices, a position that challenged centuries of social practice. Marie had not only been free from an unfortunate marriage, had established a legal precedent that other women could invoke. During the years between divorce and annulment, Marie lived in a peculiar social limbo. Officially divorced, but still technically married in the eye of the church, she occupied an ambiguous position that freed her from many social conventions while exposing her to other forms of vulnerability. He was free to travel, to maintain his own residence, to make independent decisions about his social and intellectual life, but was also the target of constant gossip and speculation. It was during this period that Marie intensified her collection of art and luxury objects. Without the responsibilities of a diplomatic wife, she could devote herself entirely to the activities that genuinely interested her. His apartments in Vienna became known in cultural circles as informal halls where artists, writers, and intellectuals gathered for discussions that varied from politics to aesthetics. Marie developed a reputation as a patron of the arts, but her sponsorship had distinctive characteristics. Instead of simply buying works by established artists, she would rather identify emerging talents and support them through regular purchases that allowed them to develop their styles without commercial pressures. His collection has grown to include paintings, sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, decorative objects from all over Europe and Asia, but the most revealing aspect of her new life was the way she organized her domestic spaces. Each room was conceived as a work of total art, where each object had been chosen not only for its individual beauty, but for its contribution to a joint aesthetic effect. It was as if Marie was creating a physical version of her personality, complex, multicultural, raffinade, but also intensely personal. The room where she welcomed guests was dominated by a collection of Venetian mirrors that reflected the light of forms that changed throughout the day, creating a constantly changeable atmosphere. The library combined first editions of French literature with medieval Arab manuscripts and works of contemporary German philosophy. Boudoir was a sanctuary of intimate objects, fan, jewelry, perfumes, photographs, each associated with a specific memory. The most significant thing was that Marie didn't treat these spaces like static museums. She constantly reorganized, added new pieces, changed arrangements, as if engaged in a continuous dialogue with her own story. The objects were not just possessions, they were collaborators in a self-default project that could not be completed through conventional means. During this period of personal reinvention, Marie also developed an extensive correspondence with intellectuals and artists from all over Europe. His letters, written in French, German, and Italian with equivalent fluency, reveal a cultivated and curious mind, interested in issues that went far beyond the topics considered appropriate for women in their class. She discussed philosophy with university professors, debated aesthetic theory with art critics, exchanged opinions on international politics with retired diplomats. These correspondences also reveal the fundamental loneliness of their position. As a woman divorced in a society that saw divorce as a scandal, as an aristocrat in a time of political transformations, as intellectual and social circles that valued more appearance than substance, Marie found few interlocutors who completely understood her situation. Their letters often express a feeling of isolation that no amount of luxury or refinement could remedy. It was also during this period that Marie began to demonstrate the first signs of what would become a lasting obsession with preservation. She began to catalog meticulously her collection, creating detailed inventories that included not only physical descriptions of objects, but also notes about their stories, their proceedings, their personal associations. It was as if she were aware that her life was becoming, herself, a collection of precious moments that needed to be preserved against forgetfulness. Marie's return to the marriage market in the mid-1880s was observed with intense interest in European social circles. At 38, she was considered one of the most elegant and cultivated women of her generation, but also one of the most complicated. Her divorce and papal annulment had released her from conventional embarrassment, but they had also marked her as someone willing to challenge fundamental social norms. In January 1886, when Marie married Bernhard von Bülow in Vienna, the ceremony represented much more than the union of two people. It was the convergence of two ambitions that complemented almost perfectly. Bülow, then 37, was recognized as one of the brightest diplomats of his generation, with a career that seemed to the highest echelons of the German government. Marie, in turn, had spent the last years developing exactly the social and cultural skills that would be essential to the wife of a first-rate politician. The marriage was celebrated at the residence of an Austrian ambassador, a choice that reflected both Bülow's diplomatic position and the international nature of the union. Marie wore a navy velvet dress with silver details, a choice that combined sobriety with elegance suitable for a second wedding, but impressive enough to mark the beginning of a new phase in her life. The small ceremony was witnessed by representatives of the main aristocratic families of Central Europe, a recognition that this was not just a personal union, but a strategic alliance. Marie von Donhoff's transformation into Princess von Bülow was even more dramatic than her previous metamorphosis. As the wife of a rising diplomat, she needed to be sophisticated enough to impress foreign cuts, but discreet enough not to overshadow her husband. It was a delicate balance that she dominated with growing mastery, developing a public presence that was simultaneously memorable and appropriate. Bülow, unlike her first husband, comprised Marie's aesthetic cultivation value and encouraged her active participation in the cultural life of the capitals where they served. When he was appointed Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in 1897 and later Chancellor in 1900, Marie took a role that went far beyond the traditional expectations of a wife Istigal. The halls Marie organized at the Chancellor's residence in Berlin became legendary for their elegance and their ability to gather disparate personalities in productive conversations. She had the gift of creating atmospheres where diplomats, artists, industrial and intellectuals were equally valued, where formal conversations about international politics could naturally evolve into discussions about art or philosophy. The secret of the success of these halls was in the meticulous attention Marie dedicated to the details. Each dinner was planned as a total work of art, where decoration, menu, guest selection, and even conversation topics were orchestrated to create a unique experience. The fans of his personal collection were often displayed as central pieces, not just for their beauty, but as starting points for conversations about culture, history, and art. Marie has developed a particular reputation for her ability to mediate among difficult personalities. At a time when European diplomacy was characterized by inflated egos and historical rivalries, it could create environments where even political opponents could interact civilly. It was a skill that became increasingly valuable as international tensions intensified in the early years of the 20th century. Marie's correspondence during this period reveals a woman who had finally found a role that used all her abilities. His letters to friends and relatives showed genuine satisfaction with his life, a feeling that he had managed to create an existence that was simultaneously useful and rewarding. She often referred to the feeling of being finally living according to her abilities. The relationship between Marie and Bülow also seemed genuinely harmonious. Unlike his first marriage, which had been widely based on social convenience, this union combined personal affection with intellectual compatibility and complementary ambitions. Letters that exchanged during the separations necessary for diplomatic work reveal intimacy and mutual respect. Marie also became confidant of Princess Victoria, wife of the future Kaiser. This friendship placed it in the center of the most exclusive circles of the Prussian court, a position it used to promote artists and cultural causes. Its influence was exercised subtly but effective through careful recommendations and strategic sponsorship. During the years Bülow served as a chancellor, Marie supervised the creation of one of the most impressive art collections of Imperial Germany. His official residence became an informal museum where old works of art coexisted with contemporary pieces, where objects of different cultures created unexpected visual dialogues. It was as if she were using her position to create a physical version of her cosmopolitan, cultivated, based on the belief that beauty and culture could transcend national and political differences. But Marie was not limited to the role of hostess. She also developed a discreet but significant participation in her husband's diplomatic activities. Bülow often consulting her on public opinion issues, especially in international contexts where her multicultural perspective was valuable. She had an intuitive understanding of how different national cultures would react to specific diplomatic initiatives. The height of Marie's power coincided with Bülow's greatest influence between 1900 and 1906. During these years, she was recognized as one of Europe's most powerful women, someone whose approval or disapproval could affect diplomatic careers and cultural projects. It was a power she exercised with acute conscience of her temporary nature and her dependence on her husband's position. It was also during this period that Marie intensified her interest in historical preservation. She began funding historical monuments restoration projects, especially in Italy, as a way of maintaining a connection with her origins, as she had the influence of her German position. These projects were carefully selected not only by their historical value, but for their ability to create cultural bridges between different European traditions. Marie's obsession with fans reached her peak during these years of power. His collection has grown to include more than 200 pieces, each catalogued and studied with the meticulousness of a professional curator. She began writing about the cultural history of the fans, producing classical rehearsals that were published in magazines specialized under pseudonyms. It was a way of establishing intellectual credibility regardless of its social position. The most revealing was that Marie treated her range of fans as a material autobiography. Here from the play was associated with a specific period of his life, a particular emotion, a personal fulfillment. The arrangement of the collection in her homes told the story of her evolution as a person and as a public figure, a visual narrative that only she could completely decipher. When contemporary observers commented on Marie's exceptional elegance, they often mentioned their ability to make luxurious objects seem natural extensions of their personality. She didn't wear jewelry, she incorporated them, did not carry fans, she animated them. It was as if she had developed a body language that turned accessories into expressive elements. This harmony between person and objects was the result of decades of conscious cultivation. Marie had learned to use luxury not as a status display, but as a communication tool. Each aesthetic choice was a subtle statement about values, aspirations, alliances. It was a form of cultural diplomacy that perfectly complemented her husband's political work. But even at the height of his power and influence, Marie had a sharp awareness of the fragility of her position. Their private letters during this period often express anxiety about the future, recognition that their influence depended entirely on the continuation of Bülow's successful career. It was a dependence she accepted, but also terrified her. The collapse began almost imperceptibly, with rumors whispered in the corridors of German imperial power. The year was 1907, and the German Empire was at the center of a series of scandals that would reveal the deep cracks in their social and political structures. For Marie von Bülow, who had spent the last 20 years carefully building her position as one of the most influential women in Europe, these rumors represent the beginning of a fall that would be as dramatic as their rise had been calculated. The Eulenburg case, as it became known, began as a dispute between German foreign policy journalists, but quickly became a sex scandal that involved some of the men closest to the Kaiser Wilhelm II. Philipp zu Eulenburg, prince and ambassador, a close friend of both Kaiser and Bülow, was publicly accused of homosexual conduct at a time when such accusations could destroy entire careers and lives. Marie watched the unfolding of events with a mixture of fascination and horror. As a woman who had sailed the complexities of aristocratic life for decades, she immediately understood the implications that the scandal would not only have for men directly involved, but for the whole social circle of which she was part. The Eulenburg case was not just about sexual behavior. It was about the nature of power, the limits of loyalty, the fragility of carefully constructed reputations. Bülow, as a chancellor, found himself in an impossible position. Eulenburg had been his most important political ally, the man who had facilitated his ascension to power through his influence on Kaiser. But the accusations against Eulenburg were so serious, and the public pressure so intense that Bülow could not defend his friend without compromising his own position. The decision to abandon Eulenburg was pragmatic, but Marie realized immediately that it represented a fundamental change in the character of her husband. During the months when the scandal dominated the headlines of the German newspapers, Marie witnessed Bülow's gradual transformation of the art defensive politician. The conversations at his dining table, previously characterized by stimulating intellectual debates, became dominated by calculations of damage and survival strategies. The halls she organized, previously celebrated by her atmosphere of refinement and culture, began to be avoided by important figures who did not want to be associated with any controversy. Marie responded to the crisis in the only way she knew, intensifying her attention to aesthetic and cultural details. If her husband's political world was crumbling, she could at least ensure that the collapse happened in an environment of impeccable beauty. Their correspondence during this period reveals a woman determined to maintain elegance patterns even as the foundations of her social life fragmented. But the most devastating to Marie was realizing that the scandal was changing the way she was seen. For years, it had been respected as a civilizing influence, a woman whose presence guaranteed that even difficult political discussions would be conducted with decorum. Now they began to circulate whispers about their own role in events, speculation about what she knew, and when she had known, hints at her complicity in covering up behaviors considered scandalous. The situation became even more complex when the Eulenburg case merged with a number of other scandals that shook public trust in the Bülow government. The Daily Telegraph incident in 1908, when Kaiser made deeply embarrassing public statements about German foreign policy, put Bülow in a position where he had to choose between defending Kaiser or defending his own political credibility. Marie watched horrified as her husband failed to sail this final crisis. Bülow's inability to simultaneously protect Kaiser and his own position revealed limitations on his political character that he had never perceived before. The man she had admired for her diplomatic ability proved unable to manage the most important crisis of her career. The decline of Bülow's influence had immediate consequences for Marie. Invitations to important social events have begun to rare. Artists and intellectuals who previously competed for their attention became evasive. His correspondence, previously extensive and varied, reduced to courtesy exchanges with a smaller and smaller circle of loyal friends. During this period of increasing isolation, Marie turned to her range of fans with an intensity that bordered on despair. Each piece became a refuge, a reminder of times when their life had been characterized by beauty and meaning rather than political survival calculations. She spent hours reorganizing the collection, creating new arrangements that reflected her emotional state in constant change. The most painful aspect of the fall was the speed with which it happened. In a matter of months, Marie became one of Europe's most sought-after hosts, to be a figure that many acquaintances would rather avoid. The European aristocracy, always sensitive to changes in fortune, quickly fit the new reality, treating Marie and Bülow with formal courtesy, but without the previous deference. Marie also had to confront the reality that her power had always been derivative, dependent entirely on her husband's position. For years, she had believed her personal cultivation, her intelligence, her social ability, guaranteed her an independent position in European society. The collapse revealed that regardless of its personal qualities, it was primarily seen as an extension of Bülow. The resignation of Bülow of the Chancellery in 1909 was simultaneously a relief and a catastrophe. On the one hand, it ended months of uncertainty and public humiliation. On the other hand, he forced Marie to confront the reality that at 61 he would have to completely rebuild his life. The couple moved to Rome, a choice that reflected both practical and emotional symbolism. Rome as a city of elegant exiles, where decline aristocrats could maintain dignity as they walked away from contexts where they had lost influence. During the final years of his life, between 1909 and 1929, Marie von Bülow experienced a peculiar form of isolation that was both chosen and imposed. The residence that the couple established in Rome became simultaneously refuge and prison, a beautifully decorated space where it could maintain the illusion of continuity with its previous life, but also definitively separated it from the centers of power and influence where it had exerted its talent for 2 decades. Marie's Roman house was a museum of her own life, every room dedicated to a different phase of her existence. The library contained not only the books it had collected over the years, but also carefully preserved correspondence, catalogued photographs, documents that witnessed their participation in the historical events of their time. It was as if she were healing her own biography, organizing the evidence of a life that had been simultaneously exceptional and representative. The collection of fans, now with more than 300 pieces, occupied an entire hall, each range mounted and labeling with information about its origin, its history, and the circumstances in which Marie had acquired him. Occasional visitors were impressed by the scholarship she demonstrated in discussing her pieces, but also disturbed by the almost obsessive intensity with which she was related to these objects. Marie developed daily rituals that structured her isolated existence. Each morning she selected a different range from her collection to carry during the day, as if the chosen object could influence her mood or activities. Each afternoon, she devoted the correspondence hours, maintaining contact with an increasing circle of friends and acquaintances around Europe. Each night she reorganized some section of her collections, as if the act of creating order in her objects could compensate for the disorder that characterized the outside world. Bülow, in turn, occupied his days writing memories that would be published posthumously. The couple developed a form of coexistence that was cordial but distant, 2 people who had shared moments of power and glory, but who now faced separately the realities of decline and aging. Marie respected her husband's need to process her political experience through writing, but found little comfort in the reminiscences of past glory. Marie's correspondence during this period reveals a woman who had developed melancholy but worthy about aging and loss of influence. Its letters often include reflections on the ephemeral nature of beauty, how objects survive the people who have them, about the value of maintaining aesthetic patterns, even when no one is observing. It was as if she was articulating an ethic of elegant decline. During the 1910s, while Europe was preparing to and then faced the Great War, Marie observed events at a distance, aware that the war represented the definitive end of the world in which she had been formed. The letters of friends and relatives reported the destruction of ancestral houses, the death of young men from known families, the collapse of social institutions who had similar eternal. Marie responded with appropriate condolences, but her letters also reveal relief for observing the catastrophe from afar. The war also intensified Marie's isolation in other ways. As a German living in Italy during a period of hostilities, she faced suspicions and restrictions that further limited her social life. The couple was forced to regularly register with local authorities, to accept limitations in their activities, to tolerate discreet but constant surveillance. It was an additional humiliation that underlined how completely his social position had deteriorated. During this time, Marie began to show signs that she understood that her collection of objects would survive her, and that this survival was somewhat important than her own longevity. It began to create even more detailed catalogs, including not only factual information about each piece, but also personal reflections on its emotional and cultural meaning. It was as if she were trying to inscribe her personality in the objects she had, ensuring that something of her essence would remain even after her death. Marie's photographs during her last years show a woman who kept posture and elegance even while age and circumstances charged her price. She continued to dress carefully, getting her hair according to styles that had been fashionable decades earlier, carrying her fans as if she were still participating in significant social events. It was a performance of dignity that had no audience but itself. The most touching aspect of Marie's final years was her relationship with employees who took care of the Roman house. Without the complex social structure of her previous life, she developed more direct and human relationships with the people who served her. Their letters mention with genuine affection to the housekeeper who understood their aesthetic needs, the gardener who kept his favorite flowers, the seamstress who adapted her clothes to the changes in her aged body. When Marie died on January 20th, 1929, at the age of 80, her death was discreetly reported in European newspapers. The obituaries mentioned their position as the wife of a German former chancellor, their reputation as a cultivated host, their contribution to cultural causes. But none managed to capture the real complexity of a life that had been dedicated to the transformation of luxury into art, social need into aesthetic expression. The dispersion of his collection after death revealed the true scope of his curatorial activities. European museums competed to acquire pieces that Marie had collected and preserved, finally recognizing the academic and cultural value of her work. The fan collection, in particular, was recognized as one of the most important of its type, a material archive of European cultural history that Marie had built through decades of disciplined passion. Hulot survived his wife for just a few months, dying in October of the same year. The couple was buried in the same cemetery in Rome, their simple tombstones contrasting with the aesthetic elaboration that had characterized their lives. It was as if, in death, they had finally found the simplicity that had been impossible during their public existence. Marie's letters and diaries, discovered after her death, revealed dimensions of her personality that she had kept carefully deprived during her life. Their writings demonstrated not only cultural refinement, but also intelligence, analytical, social observation capacity, and a sophisticated understanding of the historical forces that had shaped their time. It was as if she had secretly been the chronicler of her own era. The story of Maria Beccadelli di Bologna remains a fragmented mirror of the aristocratic female condition in the late 19th and early 20th century, a time when elite women had extraordinary material resources, but few ways for independent personal fulfillment. His life illustrates the fundamental tension between the symbolic power of luxury and the real impotence of those who had it without controlling it. Maria transformed the need into art, converting the limitations of her social position into opportunities for aesthetic refinement and intellectual cultivation. His obsession with fans was not aristocratic frivolity, but a form of resistance, a way of creating personal meaning in a social context that offered women only derivative roles. Each range in its collection represented a moment of autonomy in a life widely defined by the expectations and needs of others. What remains most disturbing in its history is the speed with which a life of influence and refinement can be reduced to silence. Mary had devoted decades to the construction of a public identity that transcended the conventional roles of wife and host, but found that this identity was more fragile than he had imagined. Her fall was not the result of personal failures, but of changes in the power structures she could not control or predict. The collection of objects that Maria left behind tells a different story from what conventional historical records preserve. While the history books recall the political scandals, the diplomatic alliances, the ascenses and falls of the powerful men of their time, the objects she collected and preserved offer insights on the intimate and aesthetic dimensions of historical experience, about how people lived, which they valued, how they found beauty and meaning in circumstances they often denied both. Mary's fate suggests unsettling questions about the nature of historical memory and which lives are considered worthy of memory. She was contemporary with figures that are still studied and celebrated, participated in events that are still analyzed by historians, influenced decisions that affected the course of European history. But his contribution was widely forgotten, reduced to footnotes in biographies of more famous men. Perhaps Mary's most significant legacy is the demonstration that seemingly privileged lives can actually be experiences of gold confinement, existences where material abundance coexists with emotional and intellectual poverty. His aesthetic refinement was not escapism, but a form of resistance to spiritual impoverishment that constantly threatened women of their position. The fragility that characterized Mary's life, dependence on unstable social positions, a vulnerability to unpredictable political changes, the need to create meaning through activities considered marginal, remains relevant to any consideration of the female condition in apparent privilege contexts. Its history suggests that luxury and power are more precarious conditions than we often imagine, and that true achievement may reside not to obtain positions of influence, but in the ability to maintain dignity and purpose even when these positions are illusory. The many fans his collected with such passion remain in European museums, admired by visitors who are unaware of the history of the woman who gathered them. It is an appropriate irony. The objects survived, but the personality that gave them meaning was forgotten. Perhaps this is the fundamental nature of luxury, its ability to outlasting those who have it, to carry fragments of human lives beyond the memory of those who have created or collected it. Maria Beccadelli. Di Bologna's life reminds us that the story is made not only of major public events, but also thousands of private existences that sailed the complexities of their times with limited resources and disproportionate hopes. His elegance was a form of courage, his cultivation a form of resistance, his collection a form of imperfect but genuine immortality. In a world that often reduces the past to simplified narratives of progress or decline, its history offers a more nuanced perspective on the human cost of historical change and the persistence of individual dignity, even in circumstances of loss and isolation.